This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today I wanted to talk about writing systems. This was a suggestion given to me by a listener via email, and it's one which does not take a lot of preparation time on my part, which is good because right now I am completely out of time. I've got a lot on my plate right now, which is why I haven't come out with a lot of episodes recently. So I figured I'd do writing systems because it's one that I think is very interesting, and indeed it's always intrigued me. But one that, to cover the basics and some sort of general issues of interest doesn't take a lot of preparation. So here we are. Why are writing systems interesting? Certainly I've mentioned in the past that writing and language are not one and the same. You can speak a language without reading or writing that language. Still, writing systems are often considered a subfield of linguistics because a system of writing and a spoken language have the same goal. That is to say that a system of writing seeks to relate a sign with a meaning, or a form with a meaning, or a signifier with the signified, if you want to put it that way. It's also closely related to the semiotics episode that we had, right? So this is very, very closely intertwined with linguistics, even if you are of the mind that it is not linguistics proper. What are the signs that what are the meanings that a writing system tries to signify? Well, those would be spoken language. So, whereas a spoken language has meanings which are, more abstract in nature, so we have, entities that we represent, we have actions that we represent through verbs in spoken language, a writing system seeks only to represent what is spoken in the language. Okay, so it seeks to be able to record things that can be spoken and understood by speakers of a language in a visual way. All right, and this is where writing systems get really interesting, because as it turns out, there's a lot more ways than one to represent what speakers of a language convey using a speech stream. Traditionally, there's more way than one to represent that in a writing system. Let's start with the English way. Now, English typically has a letter which corresponds to a sound. So when we have the letter T, for example, we know that in general in English it will make a T sound. So if you have a word written down with the letter T, you know that word contains the sound T in general. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to work. So the fact that a T is this sort of curvy line with another line through it is completely arbitrary, right? So if you remember back when we talked about semiotics, we talked about, and I think in another episode before that, episode 1 or 2, I talked about the arbitrariness of the sign. So the fact that a word in one language is a set of some sounds, and that same meaning in another language can be a set of completely different sounds, is irrelevant, right? Because the signs themselves are arbitrary. It's the meanings that we would expect to be shared. And likewise, with writing systems, this is very much the same thing. So the fact that a letter T has a particular visual form is irrelevant. What's important is that all of the readers and writers of a certain language have agreed that the letter T is the letter T, and that it has a certain set of properties. Now, English is actually a very bad language to use as an example of a writing system because English spelling is horribly, horribly, horribly inconsistent, especially in our vowels. So if, from grammar school you're told, English has, 5 vowels, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y, so sometimes 6. In reality, it's got, 11 vowels, 12 vowels, and the way that the vowels are represented is not consistent. So, O, the letter O, being, a round kind of visual shape, represents a sound O, supposedly, but in a word like women, it doesn't. It represents an I sound, right? W-O-M-E-N. Is not woman, it's women. And certainly every speaker of English would agree that that is the way to pronounce it, women. the history of English is such that the spelling system is sort of screwed up. The spelling system really reflects an earlier pronunciation, and it hasn't been reformed in many, many years, and so the English spelling system is very inconsistent. So we don't have a one-to-one relation of sign to sound in our writing system. However, in other languages, Spanish, for example, in Spanish, you have very close to a one-to-one relation between the vowel symbols and the vowels that they represent. Okay, so when you're reading Spanish, in terms of pronunciation, you can make a much more educated guess as to how a word is pronounced by seeing its spelling. Okay. Now let's step back a little bit. Why can we make assumptions about how a word is pronounced based on its spelling? Well, it's based on the fact that the writing system is trying to reproduce the spoken word by splitting up sound segments and assigning them certain characters, certain symbols. Okay, so let's assume for a minute that the English spelling system is not inconsistent, that we do have a one-to-one correspondence between sound and symbol. Alright, now that would be a writing system in which every phone that we can pronounce had its own system. Like I said, English is not like this, but we're just being hypothetical here to show a larger generalization. This is one particular method that can be utilized by a language for a writing system. So you have one phone, and you have then one symbol. There is a system that is like this. That would be the International Phonetic Alphabet. The purpose of the International Phonetic Alphabet is to have a one-to-one correspondence of sound and symbol. So you have, things in IPA like T, which always are an alveolar stop, voiceless alveolar stop, unless you put some other diacritic on that symbol to show that there is something special about the way that particular sound is being pronounced. Maybe you aspirate it or you don't, so you put the little H after it or you don't. IPA is an attempt to make such a writing system that is perfectly linked to the sounds that are being represented by the characters. Okay. That type of writing system is what English speakers will generally think of when they think of written language. They will think, well, yes, there is an intimate link between the pronunciation and the symbols on the page, because the symbols are representing sounds. They're representing phones. But in fact, that's only one possible strategy for a writing system, and there are others. So, let's start with Japanese. Japanese is interesting because it's a mixed writing system. It uses several different strategies. The strategy that is most commonly cited in Japanese is the Kana strategy, the strategy that the Kana in Japanese use. The Kana syllabary is just what it sounds like. It's a syllabary, syllable, right? You have certain groupings of phones which are represented by a single character. So, whereas in an English-style writing system where you have one phone, one character, something like ma is represented by two letters, an M and an A. In a Japanese-style system, and indeed this is how the Japanese Kana does it, a sound like ma is represented with one character. Why? Because Kana in Japanese will generally represent a consonant and a vowel together. Okay, so you have what are essentially syllables in Japanese being represented by single characters. Now, you're still representing the spoken sound. You're still representing a certain pronunciation, but you are splitting up the ratio of phones to characters differently. So in Japanese, generally, with the Kana, you're saying you have two phones which are represented by one symbol. In an English-style system, you have one phone represented by one symbol. Indeed, an IPA-style system is a perfect matching of one phone to one symbol. So that's interesting in and of itself, right? So you can split up sounds differently in the way that you choose to represent them. You're still representing pronunciations with your writing system, but you're splitting them up differently. Now, in Japanese, in the Kana, there is one exception to this, which is the Japanese nasal phoneme, which can basically, it assimilates to the place of articulation of the, let's see, the following phone. So it can be an M in some cases, it can be an N in other places. So M-pitsu for a pencil. But if you had, something like inu, dog, then it comes out as an N. And this is very interesting. So that is the only symbol in the Japanese kana which represents just one sound, except for the vowels, right? So that's the only consonant, I should say, that is represented by just one symbol in Japanese. But most of them, like I said, are a mix of a consonant and a vowel. So two phones, one symbol. Now, so far, both of those systems are representing sounds in visual form. But there is another sort of paradigm entirely that can be used and is used very commonly, and that is not representing sounds with your writing system, but representing meanings with your writing system. So this is another place where Japanese is very interesting. Japanese, of course, has two basic writing systems that it employs. One is the kana, which represents two phones with one symbol, generally. So sound system being represented by a visual system. And the other is the kanji. And the kanji is essentially the use of Chinese characters, which don't represent necessarily sounds, but represent meanings. So here you have a writing system that is semantically based instead of phonetically. This is the basic split that you have among the writing systems of the world. Writing systems will generally either be phonetically based or semantically based. Under a semantically based system, you don't have one symbol representing one sound or even one symbol representing two sounds, but you will have one symbol representing one meaning in general. Okay, now, there's exceptions to this. You can have things that are ambiguous. You can have one symbol representing two meanings. You can have one symbol that ends up only representing one particular sound because that's the way that the meaning is represented in the language. So, for example, in Japanese, like I said, inu means dog, and it would be represented by one kanji symbol, meaning inu. Likewise, neko, meaning cat, is represented by one kanji, which means cat. Now, the interesting thing is that the pronunciation really is secondary to the meaning in these symbols, right? The symbol represents the concept of cat. Nothing about the symbol intrinsically tells you that it's pronounced neko. If you are a speaker of Japanese and you know a lot of kanji, you can go through a Chinese newspaper and pick out a lot of meanings in the characters, even if you don't speak Chinese. Why? Because the pronunciation is unimportant. A lot of the characters you'll be able to recognize what they mean because your Japanese writing system shares a lot of these same characters. So Japanese is a mix of a writing system which utilizes meaning and a writing system which utilizes sound. And for that, it's very, very interesting, right? There is no reason, in principle, why you could not use the kanji, the Chinese character system, in English. So, for example, you could have, Chinese characters representing nouns in English, and the rest you could use our regular, letter to sound correspondence system. In principle, there's no reason why we don't do that. The only reason that we don't do that is for historical reasons, right? That we took over, or we use the system that was used by previous languages in our same family, and that system has been sort of modified in English. It's not as exact, but that's why we use it. So again, there's no intrinsic link between language type and writing system. It's simply historical accident. But the generalizations we can make is you either write down the sounds of your language or you write down the meanings of your language. And that's it. There isn't really another way to do it. Now, Japanese, I keep going back to because it's extremely interesting. Most of the time, what you will have is grammatical items. So grammatical morphemes in Japanese will be written with the kana, and nouns and verbs, really highly conceptual items, are written down with the kanji. So you have the conceptual system, which links a symbol to a meaning, being used for those items which are really strongly conceptual. And then for those items which are strongly grammatical, you use the sounds. It makes a lot of sense. It's a really interesting system. Korean uses a different system known as Hangul. So Hangul is, again, a symbol-to-sound correspondence system. So you have different symbols, and actually Hangul is a really beautiful system because it literally has a one-to-one correspondence, but the way that they mix the symbols together is quite different from English. I don't have really the time to go into the Hangul system now, but if you're interested in writing systems, Hangul is one to look at. It's considered by many linguists to be a very, very beautiful writing system, and one which is really quite logical in the way it splits things up. That's the basic premise I wanted to give to you guys today, is the fact that, writing systems can either represent meanings or they can represent sounds. I think as English speakers we take for granted that other possibility, that your writing system may not be concerned with pronunciation at all. And indeed there are advantages to that. So in the history of China, you find that the standardization of the writing system is one way that the Chinese Empire was able to function and still have these many, many different dialects of Chinese languages which exist to this day. So you do have mutually unintelligible Chinese languages which are brought together and indeed referred to as simply quote-unquote Chinese because they share the same writing system, and they're able to do that because their writing system does not encode necessarily for phonetic information. It only encodes for meaning information. So it's a very interesting issue when you think about the not only the similarities and differences between writing systems, but the advantages and disadvantages. So China would not have been able to standardize their system so beautifully if it hadn't been for the fact that their system works with meanings and not with sounds. It gets you over a lot of hurdles that would otherwise be there. But of course, there is an inherent advantage to having a system which relates sound and symbol, and that is that the pronunciation is a lot easier when you're learning, or it should be, unless you're learning English, in which case all bets are off. So that is basically just what I wanted to introduce you guys. Hopefully at least piqued your interest in writing systems. Like I said, it's an area that I've always been interested in. I will probably do another episode later, which is more detailed, where I go over some of the historical aspects of the development of our writing system, development of other writing systems, but I just wanted to introduce the basic concept today, and given the amount of time that I have to work on this episode, I think that was a good goal. I will make a suggestion for a book that you guys can check out from the library and kind of use to get some more information on this in the meantime. That book is Writings by Florian Kolmas. It's called Writing Systems: An Introduction to the Linguistic Analysis. It's in the Cambridge Textbooks in Linguistics series. It's a very good book, very, very detailed, and it's presented in a way that you can just sort of flip through it and just kind of look at tons of different writing systems, how they represent sounds. Most of the phonetic systems will simply differ in the types of sounds that they represent by their symbols, right? So if they are presenting single sounds, they will represent different single sounds, or they'll represent groups of sounds, or they'll do both. They can represent a group of sounds and sounds in the same system. There has been some argument that the reason we say a sound is affricate is because, in the Indo-European tradition, those are generally represented by a single symbol in a language, although there are other arguments for saying that affricates are indeed single sounds. But anyway, so lots of issues come from writing systems, and when you get into systems that represent meanings with symbols, then you get all kinds of different interesting things. The relation of the ideographs to their corresponding meanings, visual similarities between the signs and the signified, so on and so forth. Hieroglyphic systems, which are related to logographic systems, mixed systems like Japanese. Very, very interesting stuff here. So I will do a follow-up episode when I have some more time and go into more detail. I'll do one that is the history of the Latin typewriting system, and another one which will probably be on the history of the Chinese logographic system, because that's a really interesting one. So anyway, I hope you found this short, 20-ish minutes or so episode appealing and intriguing, and I thank you as always for listening. I get comments as always on Twitter @LinguistChris, or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Thanks again.